You've worked your entire life to build something from nothing. Every brick, every table, every dream poured into four walls that represent everything you've sacrificed for. Now imagine walking into that very place, disguised as a stranger, only to discover that the people you trusted most have been living a lie right under your nose. Marcus Johnson thought he knew his diner inside and out. He thought he knew his employees, his customers, his community. But sometimes the biggest revelations come when we see ourselves through someone else's eyes. Sometimes it takes becoming invisible in your own world to see the truth that was hiding in plain sight. What Marcus discovered that ordinary Tuesday morning would change everything he believed about loyalty, prejudice, and the price of success. It would force him to confront uncomfortable truths about the business he built and the community he served. Most importantly, it would show him that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't confrontation, it's the quiet dignity of simply being yourself. This is the story of a man who went undercover in his own life and discovered that the real test of character isn't how you treat people when they know who you are, it's how you treat them when they think nobody's watching. Marcus Johnson stood at the corner of 5th and Main, watching the morning rush begin at Johnson's Diner. Through the large front windows, steam rose from coffee cups, creating small clouds against the glass as customers huddled over their breakfast plates. The red and white checkered tablecloths caught the early sunlight, and the vintage neon sign buzzed quietly overhead. For 37 years, this had been more than just a business to Marcus. It had been his life's work, his legacy, his proof that dreams could become reality if you were willing to work hard enough and believe long enough. The diner hadn't always looked this way. When Marcus first bought the rundown building in 1987, it was nothing more than a skeleton of broken dreams and peeling paint. The previous owner had given up after 6 months, claiming the neighborhood wasn't right for a family restaurant, but Marcus saw something different. He saw potential in the cracked foundation, possibility in the boarded-up windows. And most importantly, he saw a community that needed a place to gather, to share stories, to feel like they belonged somewhere. Those early days had been brutal. Marcus worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. He learned to cook by trial and error, burning more meals than he served in those first few weeks. His hands were permanently stained with grease and paint. His back ached from lifting heavy equipment, and his bank account dwindled to almost nothing more times than he cared to remember. But every morning he unlocked those doors with the same determination that had carried him through his childhood in the projects, through his years in the military, and through the countless rejections he'd faced when trying to secure a business loan. The neighborhood had been skeptical at first. Marcus was an outsider, a black man trying to establish roots in a predominantly white working-class community. Some residents crossed the street rather than walk past the diner during those early months. Others peered through the windows with curiosity but never quite worked up the courage to come inside. Marcus understood their hesitation. Change was never easy, and he represented something unfamiliar in their small, tight-knit world. But Marcus had a secret weapon: his food. His grandmother's cornbread recipe, passed down through 3 generations. His mother's method for making gravy so rich it could make a grown man weep. The way his father taught him to season eggs so they tasted like clouds kissed by heaven. Slowly, one customer at a time, the magic of good food began to break down barriers that words alone never could. Henderson was the first to cross the threshold. She was an elderly widow who lived in the apartment above the flower shop next door. Marcus still remembered the way she hesitated at the door that grey October morning, her hand hovering over the handle for almost 30 seconds before she finally pushed inside. She ordered black coffee and dry toast, the safest items on the menu. But when Marcus brought her plate, he'd added a small side of his grandmother's cornbread, warm from the oven and glistening with butter. The transformation on Mrs. Henderson's face when she took that first bite was everything Marcus had hoped for. Her eyes widened, then softened, and for a moment she looked like a young girl tasting something magical for the first time. She finished every crumb and asked for the recipe. Marcus told her it was a family secret, but he'd be happy to make it for her any time she wanted. She became a regular customer within a week and brought her sister the following month. Word spread the way good news always does in small communities. Quietly, through whispered conversations and satisfied smiles, the mailman started stopping by for lunch. The mechanics from the garage down the street discovered Marcus made the best burgers in 3 counties. Young mothers found it was a safe place to bring their children, where high chairs were always clean and Marcus kept a basket of crayons behind the counter. By the end of the 2nd year, Johnson's Diner had become the unofficial heart of the neighborhood. It was where the hardware store owner came to complain about his suppliers over morning coffee. It was where the high school football team celebrated their victories and mourned their defeats. It was where first dates happened, where breakups were processed over chocolate pie, where business deals were sealed with handshakes over chicken and waffles. Marcus hired his first employee in year 3, a young single mother named Sarah, who needed flexible hours and patient training. She was nervous about working for a black owner, having grown up in a household where certain prejudices were spoken like gospel truth. But Marcus treated her with respect, taught her everything she needed to know, and gave her the kind of steady employment that allowed her to provide for her daughter with dignity. Within 6 months, Sarah was defending Marcus against any customer who showed even a hint of disrespect. The diner grew slowly but steadily. Marcus added new menu items based on customer requests and seasonal availability. He installed a jukebox filled with music from every decade, creating a soundtrack that made everyone feel welcome, regardless of their generation. He painted murals on the walls depicting the neighborhood's history, including images of the factories that had once employed most of the residents, and the schools where their children learned to read. Through it all, Marcus maintained his vision of what the diner could be. It wasn't just about serving food. It was about creating a space where people could be themselves, where the factory worker could sit next to the bank manager without anyone feeling out of place, where teenagers could afford a burger and fries on their allowance, and where seniors could nurse a cup of coffee for hours while playing checkers without being rushed. The community responded to Marcus's vision by embracing him as one of their own. They celebrated when he finally paid off the building loan. They helped him recover when a kitchen fire forced him to close for 2 months. They defended him when a chain restaurant tried to move into the vacant lot across the street, organizing protests and boycotts that eventually sent the corporate developers looking for easier targets. Marcus thought he knew every regular customer by name, every employee's family situation, every supplier's delivery schedule. He thought he understood the rhythms of his community, the unspoken rules that governed how people interacted with each other. He believed that 37 years of shared breakfasts and dinner conversations had earned him not just acceptance, but genuine respect and affection. But success has a way of creating distance between an owner and the day-to-day reality of their business. As the diner became more profitable, Marcus found himself spending more time in his office managing finances and less time on the floor talking with customers. He hired additional staff to handle the increased volume, trusting his long-time employees to train newcomers and maintain the standards he had established. Marcus began taking more time off, confident that his team could handle operations without constant supervision. He traveled to visit his daughter in college, took long weekends to visit his elderly mother, even managed a real vacation for the first time in decades. The diner continued running smoothly in his absence, which he took as proof that he had built something sustainable and self-sufficient. What Marcus didn't realize was that his absence, however well-intentioned, had created space for attitudes and behaviors that would have never been tolerated under his direct oversight. Small comments that went unchallenged, subtle changes in service that affected certain customers differently than others, the gradual erosion of the inclusive culture he had worked so hard to create. The irony was that Marcus's very success, the trust his community had placed in him, the reputation he had built, the financial security he had achieved, had made him complacent about the ongoing work required to maintain the values that had made that success possible. He assumed that because he had overcome prejudice and built something beautiful, the battle was won. He forgot that tolerance and acceptance are not permanent victories, but daily choices that must be reinforced through constant vigilance and active commitment. As Marcus stood on that corner, watching the morning rush, he had no idea that his world was about to be turned upside down. He didn't know that his decision to step back from daily operations had allowed something toxic to take root in the business he loved. He couldn't have imagined that his own employees, people he considered family, were capable of the betrayal he was about to witness. The morning looked like every other morning. The coffee smelled the same. The familiar sounds of conversation and clinking dishes drifted through the windows. Everything appeared normal on the surface, which is exactly why Marcus had no reason to suspect that underneath the veneer of his successful, integrated, harmonious diner, a very different reality was taking shape. A reality that would force him to confront the uncomfortable truth that building something good is only the beginning. Protecting it requires eternal vigilance. The idea came to Marcus on a rainy Thursday evening while he was reviewing employee schedules in his home office. His daughter Jasmine was visiting from law school, and over dinner she had mentioned a case study from her employment law class about workplace discrimination. The professor had asked students to consider how bias could exist even in environments that appeared welcoming and inclusive on the surface. The most insidious forms of discrimination, Jasmine had explained, twirling spaghetti around her fork, are the ones that happen when people think nobody important is watching. When authority figures are absent, people's true attitudes often emerge. Marcus had nodded thoughtfully, but the comment stuck with him as he worked through payroll that evening. When was the last time he had experienced his diner as a customer rather than as the owner? When had he last sat in a booth, ordered from the menu, and observed how his staff interacted with guests when they didn't know he was evaluating their performance? The more he thought about it, the more Marcus realized that his presence always changed the dynamic. When employees knew he was watching, they were on their best behavior. When customers knew he was the owner, they treated him with a deference that might not extend to other patrons. He had built his understanding of the diner's culture based on interactions that were fundamentally different from the everyday experiences of regular customers. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks developing his plan. He would need a disguise convincing enough to fool employees who had worked with him for years. He would need to alter his usual behavior patterns, his posture, his way of speaking, even his choice of seating. Most importantly, he would need to suppress his natural instinct to intervene if he witnessed anything that violated his standards. The goal was observation, not correction. He needed to understand what was really happening before he could address any problems. The physical transformation required careful planning. Marcus's salt and pepper beard was his most distinctive feature, so he shaved it off completely, revealing a jawline that looked 10 years younger. He bought reading glasses with thick black frames that changed the shape of his face. A visit to a discount clothing store provided him with outfits that were completely unlike his usual attire. Wrinkled khakis, faded plaid shirts, worn sneakers that had seen better days. Marcus practiced changing his posture, slouching his shoulders and shuffling his feet in a way that made him appear smaller and less confident. He worked on altering his voice, speaking more softly and with less authority than his usual commanding tone. He studied the behavior of some of his more timid customers, noting how they avoided eye contact with staff and seemed to apologize for taking up space. The psychological preparation was more challenging than the physical changes. Marcus had to convince himself to become invisible, to suppress 37 years of ownership instincts. Every fiber of his being was programmed to notice problems and fix them immediately. He would have to watch his employees work without correcting mistakes, observe customer service without stepping in to help, and witness conversations without participating in discussions he would normally lead. Marcus chose a Tuesday morning for his undercover visit. Tuesdays were typically quiet, with a steady but manageable flow of regular customers and enough staff to handle the workload without stress. He wanted normal conditions, not the chaos of a weekend rush or the skeleton crew of a late weeknight shift. He parked 3 blocks away from the diner and walked slowly toward the building, taking time to observe the neighborhood from this new perspective. Details he had never noticed before caught his attention. Graffiti on the stop sign that needed to be reported, a broken sidewalk that could trip elderly pedestrians, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot that should be addressed. Standing outside the diner's front entrance, Marcus felt an unexpected wave of nervousness. This was his building, his business, his life's work, but he was approaching it as a stranger. Through the windows, he could see the morning staff preparing for the day. Sarah was wiping down tables while chatting with Miguel, the cook who had been with the diner for 8 years. Jennifer, one of his newer hires, was filling salt and pepper shakers with the methodical precision he had come to appreciate. Marcus pushed through the front door, and the familiar chime announced his arrival just as it had thousands of times before. But this time, nobody looked up with recognition. Nobody called out a greeting. Nobody rushed to shake his hand or ask about his family. For the first time in decades, Marcus Johnson entered Johnson's diner as just another customer. The sensation was profoundly disorienting. The layout that he knew by heart suddenly seemed foreign when viewed from a customer's perspective. The lighting appeared dimmer than he remembered. The background noise of kitchen equipment and conversation seemed louder. Even the smell, that distinctive blend of coffee, bacon grease, and cleaning supplies that he associated with home, struck him differently when experienced without the filter of ownership pride. Marcus chose a booth in the corner, one that offered a clear view of both the dining area and the service counter. The red vinyl seat was more worn than he had realized, with small tears that his maintenance crew should have repaired months ago. The laminated menu was sticky with residue that hadn't been properly cleaned. Small details that would have prompted immediate action if he had noticed them during a normal inspection now had to be mentally catalogued for later attention. Sarah approached his table with a coffee pot and a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus kept his head down, studying the menu with exaggerated concentration to avoid direct eye contact. He ordered black coffee and wheat toast, the simplest items available, speaking in the softer voice he had practiced. Sarah nodded without enthusiasm and walked away to place his order. The interaction felt completely different from every other exchange Marcus had ever had with Sarah. There was no warmth, no personal connection, no sense that she cared whether he enjoyed his experience or ever returned. She was going through the motions of customer service without any genuine engagement. Marcus told himself that it was early in the day, that Sarah might be tired or dealing with personal problems, but the difference was stark enough to be troubling. While waiting for his order, Marcus observed the interactions between staff members and other customers. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for oatmeal and herbal tea, received the same perfunctory service that Marcus had experienced. Her special dietary requests, no butter on the toast, extra honey for the tea, were handled with visible irritation rather than the accommodating spirit Marcus thought he had instilled in his training programs. 2 construction workers at the counter were treated with notably more attention. Their jokes were laughed at, their coffee was refilled without being asked, and their orders were taken with genuine smiles. The contrast was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus began to wonder if what he was witnessing was simply the natural tendency for people to connect more easily with customers who were similar to themselves, or if there was something more systematic at work. His toast arrived on a plate that wasn't quite cleaned, with butter pats that had clearly been sitting out too long. The coffee was lukewarm and tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. Marcus had to bite his tongue to keep from calling Sarah over to address the quality issues. Instead, he ate in silence, continuing to observe and take mental notes. A young black man entered the diner around 9:30, dressed in business attire and carrying a briefcase. He chose a table near the window and picked up a menu. Marcus watched carefully as the staff noticed the new customer. There was no immediate rush to provide service, no welcoming greeting, no offer of coffee while he decided what to order. The young man waited several minutes before Sarah finally approached his table, and even then her demeanor was noticeably cooler than it had been with the construction workers. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising as he watched the interaction. The young man ordered a simple breakfast, eggs, hash browns, wheat toast, but Sarah seemed to find his presence somehow problematic. She took his order with minimal conversation and returned to the kitchen with an expression that Marcus could only describe as annoyed. When the food came out, it was delivered without the small courtesies. Hot sauce on the side, extra napkins, refilled coffee that Marcus had seen provided to other customers. The pattern became clearer as the morning progressed. White customers, especially those who appeared to be locals or regulars, received warm, attentive service. Customers of color, elderly patrons, and anyone who seemed unfamiliar or different were treated with a level of indifference that bordered on hostility. The differences were subtle enough that individual incidents could be explained away, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. Marcus realized that his employees had developed a 2-tiered system of service that he had never noticed because his presence automatically elevated every customer's experience. When the owner was watching, everyone received the best possible treatment. When he wasn't there, people were served according to their perceived value or social standing within the community hierarchy. The discovery was devastating, but Marcus forced himself to maintain his cover. He finished his meal, left an appropriate tip, and walked out of the diner without revealing his identity. The transformation had worked too well. He had successfully become invisible in his own establishment, and what he had seen while invisible shattered many of his assumptions about the business. He thought he understood completely. As Marcus walked back to his car, his mind raced with questions and implications. How long had this been going on? How many customers had been driven away by poor service that he never witnessed? How had he failed so completely to instill his values in employees he had trusted and trained? Most importantly, what was he going to do about it? The undercover experiment had revealed a truth that Marcus wasn't sure he was prepared to face, but there was no going back to ignorance now. Marcus couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's indifferent expression as she served the young businessman, heard the subtle edge in Jennifer's voice when she spoke to Mrs. Chen, remembered the way his own breakfast had been carelessly prepared and served. The images played on repeat, each one chipping away at his confidence in everything he thought he had built. He spent the early morning hours pacing his living room, trying to rationalize what he had witnessed. Maybe it was an off day. Maybe the staff had been dealing with difficult customers earlier and their patience was wearing thin. Maybe he had misinterpreted normal variations in personality and energy level as something more sinister. But deep in his heart, Marcus knew he was making excuses because the truth was too painful to accept. By dawn, Marcus had made his decision. He needed more evidence before confronting his employees. One observation session wasn't enough to understand the full scope of the problem or to develop an effective solution. He would return to the diner in his disguise, but this time he would pay closer attention to the specific words being used, the body language being displayed, and the systematic patterns that governed who received good service and who didn't. Marcus modified his appearance slightly for the second visit, adding a baseball cap and changing his shirt to further reduce the chances of recognition. He arrived at the diner during the lunch rush, when the pace would be faster and the staff would be under more pressure. Stress had a way of revealing people's true attitudes when they didn't have time to maintain careful facades. The lunch crowd was a mix of blue-collar workers, office employees grabbing quick meals, and elderly customers who preferred eating their main meal in the middle of the day. Marcus took a seat at the counter this time, positioned where he could hear conversations between staff members and observe their interactions with customers from a closer vantage point. Miguel was working the grill with his usual efficiency, calling out orders and managing multiple dishes simultaneously. Marcus had always respected Miguel's work ethic and culinary skills, but now he listened more carefully to the casual comments the cook made between orders. When preparing a meal for an elderly black woman, Miguel muttered something in Spanish that made Jennifer laugh. Marcus didn't speak Spanish fluently, but he caught enough words to understand that the comment had been dismissive and unkind. Jennifer took the woman's order with exaggerated patience, speaking slowly and loudly as if the customer were mentally impaired rather than simply elderly. When the woman asked for her hamburger to be cooked well done, Jennifer rolled her eyes and made a comment about people who didn't know how to appreciate good food. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, though she kept her tone just professional enough to avoid an obvious complaint. Marcus watched as the same pattern played out with other customers throughout the lunch hour. A Latino construction worker was told that the daily special was sold out, even though Marcus could see portions of it still available in the kitchen. A teenage girl who appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent was charged for items that other customers received for free. An older white man who seemed confused by the menu received patient assistance and recommendations, while a young black woman asking the same questions was treated as if she were being deliberately difficult. The most disturbing moment came when two customers arrived at almost the same time, a well-dressed white businessman and a black woman in scrubs who was obviously on break from a medical job. Both looked tired and hungry. Both were polite and ready to order quickly. But Jennifer approached the businessman immediately, while the woman in scrubs waited nearly 10 minutes before receiving any acknowledgement. When Marcus finally caught Jennifer's attention to order his own meal, she was pleasant but impersonal. He asked for the meatloaf special, and she brought him a portion that was noticeably smaller than what he had seen served to other customers. The vegetables were overcooked and the gravy was congealing, as if his plate had been sitting under a heat lamp longer than necessary. As Marcus ate his disappointing meal, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two staff members were discussing a customer complaint that had been filed the previous week. A black family had written to complain about slow service and what they perceived as discriminatory treatment during their visit to the diner. "Can you believe these people?" Jennifer was saying to Sarah as they worked near Marcus's seat at the counter. "They come in here expecting special treatment, and when they don't get it, they play the race card. It's so typical." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I know, right? Like we're supposed to bend over backwards for everyone who walks through that door. Some people just don't understand that good service is something you earn through respect and common courtesy." "Exactly," Jennifer continued. "And the worst part is that Marcus always takes their side. He doesn't see what we have to deal with every day. He just hears the complaints and assumes we're doing something wrong." Marcus gripped his coffee cup to keep his hands from shaking. The casual racism in their conversation was shocking enough, but the revelation that they had been intercepting complaints and hiding problems from him was even worse. How many customers had tried to bring issues to his attention only to have their concerns dismissed or explained away by employees who had no intention of changing their behavior? "Speaking of Marcus," Sarah said, lowering her voice slightly, "have you noticed he's been coming around less lately? I think he's finally realizing that this place runs fine without him hovering over everyone all the time." "Good," Jennifer replied. "I like him and everything, but sometimes I think he's a little too sensitive about certain things. Not everyone who complains has a legitimate point. Some people just look for reasons to be offended." The conversation continued, but Marcus had heard enough. The two women he had trusted to represent his values and maintain his standards were not only failing to do so, but they were actively undermining the inclusive culture he had worked decades to create. They were filtering his communication with customers, misrepresenting complaints, and perpetuating exactly the kind of attitudes that Marcus had hoped his business would help overcome. Marcus finished his meal in stunned silence, paid his bill, and left the diner feeling more shaken than he had after the first visit. The problem was deeper and more systematic than he had initially suspected. It wasn't just about inconsistent service or individual bad days. His employees had developed their own culture within his business, one that directly contradicted everything he stood for. Walking back to his car, Marcus passed the diner's front window and glanced inside. From the outside, everything looked normal. Customers were eating, staff were working, the atmosphere appeared friendly and welcoming. But Marcus now knew that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. Behind the familiar red and white tablecloths and warm lighting, a different reality was playing out, one where customers were judged and treated according to prejudices that Marcus had naively believed his business could help eliminate. The weight of the revelation settled over Marcus as he drove home. This wasn't just about fixing employee attitudes or improving training procedures. This was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that good intentions and inclusive policies meant nothing if they weren't consistently enforced and genuinely embraced by everyone involved. Marcus realized that his gradual withdrawal from day-to-day operations had created a vacuum that was filled not with the values he had tried to instill, but with the broader societal attitudes that his employees brought from their lives outside the diner. Without his constant presence and active reinforcement, the culture had slowly shifted toward reflecting the prejudices and assumptions that existed in the wider community. The discovery forced Marcus to question everything he thought he knew about his employees, his customers, and his community. Had the acceptance and respect he believed he had earned been genuine, or had it been contingent on his economic success and social status? Were the friendships he had built with customers and staff real, or were they based on the power dynamics of business relationships? Most painfully, Marcus had to confront the possibility that his presence had been masking problems rather than preventing them. By being visible and involved, he had encouraged people to hide their true attitudes rather than change them. He had created an environment where discrimination was suppressed rather than eliminated, where prejudice learned to be more subtle rather than disappearing entirely. As Marcus sat in his home office that evening, staring at employee files and customer feedback forms, he understood that the Undercover experiment had revealed more than just poor service or unprofessional behavior. It had exposed a fundamental failure in his leadership and a painful gap between his aspirations for the business and the reality of what it had become. The question now was what he was going to do about it. Confronting the employees directly would likely result in denials and excuses. Firing everyone would destroy the business he had spent decades building. But continuing to operate while knowing that customers were being mistreated was completely unacceptable. Marcus needed a plan that would address the immediate problems while also ensuring that such issues never developed again. He needed to find a way to rebuild the culture of his diner on a foundation strong enough to withstand the test of time and the challenge of human nature. Most importantly, he needed to figure out how to regain control of his business without destroying the relationships and reputation that made it worth saving. Marcus returned to the diner for a third undercover visit. This time during the evening dinner shift, he needed to understand if the problems he had witnessed were limited to certain employees or if they extended throughout his entire staff. The dinner crew included some of his longest-serving employees, people he had considered family for over a decade. He chose a different disguise for the evening visit, adding a slight limp and using a walking cane to further alter his appearance and posture. The physical discomfort of maintaining the fake limp actually helped him stay in character, reminding him constantly that he was playing a role rather than simply being himself. The dinner crowd was smaller and more relaxed than the lunch rush, with families and couples settling in for leisurely meals. Marcus took a table near the back of the dining room, close enough to the service station to overhear staff conversations, but far enough from the kitchen to avoid being recognized by Miguel, who would be the most likely to see through his disguise. The evening manager was Patricia, a woman who had been with the diner for 15 years. Marcus had promoted her to supervisor 3 years earlier, trusting her to maintain quality and standards during evening hours when he was rarely present. Patricia had always impressed him with her attention to detail and her ability to handle difficult situations with grace and professionalism. As Marcus watched Patricia work, he initially felt relieved. She was efficient, professional, and seemed to treat all customers with equal courtesy. When a young couple with 2 small children sat down at a nearby table, Patricia personally ensured they had high chairs and extra napkins. When an elderly man needed help reading the menu due to poor eyesight, she patiently described each item and made thoughtful recommendations. Marcus began to hope that the problems he had identified were limited to the day shift, that Patricia and her evening crew had maintained the standards he had worked so hard to establish, but his optimism was premature. The moment that changed everything came when Marcus was preparing to leave. He had finished his meal, which had been properly prepared and courteously served, and was waiting for his check when a well-dressed black man in his 30s entered the diner. The man looked around uncertainly, as if deciding whether to stay or find somewhere else to eat. Patricia approached the new customer with her usual professional smile and guided him to a table in the center of the dining room. Marcus watched the interaction carefully, looking for signs of the discriminatory behavior he had witnessed during earlier visits. Initially, everything appeared normal. Patricia provided the customer with a menu and water, took his drink order efficiently, and seemed to be maintaining her usual high standards of service. But then Marcus heard it. The whisper that made his blood freeze in his veins. As Patricia walked past the service station after seating the black customer, she leaned close to Danny, one of the evening servers, and spoke in a voice that she clearly thought was too quiet for anyone else to hear. But Marcus's table was positioned at just the right angle, and the dining room was quiet enough that her words carried further than she intended. "Table 12, Patricia said, her voice barely audible but unmistakably clear to Marcus. "Make sure you keep an eye on him. You know how they are about trying to skip out on their bills." The casual racism of the comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't the heat-of-the-moment frustration he had witnessed during busy lunch shifts or the thoughtless remarks of newer employees who might not understand the diner's values. This was his most trusted supervisor, a woman he had known for 15 years, casually expressing a prejudiced assumption about a customer based solely on his race. Danny nodded in response to Patricia's instruction, and Marcus watched in horror as the young server's entire demeanor toward the black customer changed. Where there had been neutral professionalism, there was now suspicion and surveillance. Danny made frequent trips past table 12, always finding reasons to check on nearby tables or clean already clean surfaces, clearly monitoring the customer's behavior for signs of the dishonesty that Patricia had warned him to expect. The customer seemed to sense the increased attention, though he probably couldn't identify exactly what was making him uncomfortable. He ordered quickly when Danny approached, chose moderately priced items from the menu, and remained polite despite the obviously unwelcoming atmosphere that had developed around him. When his food arrived, it was served with minimal conversation and no follow-up to ensure everything was satisfactory. Marcus sat transfixed, watching the systematic dehumanization of a paying customer by employees he had trusted and respected. The man at table 12 was clearly a professional. His clothing suggested a white-collar job. His manner was polite and educated. His order was reasonable, and he had the money to pay for it. Yet Patricia had automatically assumed he was a potential thief based entirely on racial stereotypes. The most devastating aspect of the incident was how routine it appeared. Patricia's whispered warning to Danny had the casual efficiency of an established procedure. This wasn't the first time such instructions had been given, and it clearly wasn't seen as unusual or problematic by the staff involved. The discrimination Marcus was witnessing had become institutionalized, a normal part of evening operations that happened whenever Patricia judged a customer to be potentially problematic. As the evening progressed, Marcus observed other examples of Patricia's selective vigilance. A group of young Latino men was seated near the back of the restaurant and watched carefully throughout their meal. A black family with teenagers was served efficiently but without warmth, and Danny made sure to present their check promptly, rather than allowing them to linger over dessert. Meanwhile, white customers of all ages were treated with the genuine hospitality that Marcus thought represented his diner's culture. The contrast was stark and systematic. Patricia had developed a two-tiered system of customer management that provided excellent service to some while creating an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility for others. The discrimination wasn't overt enough to generate obvious complaints, but it was pervasive enough to ensure that customers of color felt unwelcome and were unlikely to return or recommend the restaurant to others. Marcus realized that Patricia's whispered comment about Table 12 represented something far worse than individual prejudice. It revealed a culture of discrimination that had been carefully hidden from his view, operating through coded language and subtle behaviors that wouldn't be obvious to a casual observer. His most trusted employees had learned to discriminate quietly and efficiently, maintaining plausible deniability while systematically driving away customers who didn't fit their preferred demographics. The customer at Table 12 finished his meal quickly, paid his bill without complaint, and left a standard tip despite the poor treatment he had received. As he walked toward the door, Marcus could see the relief in his posture. The man was clearly glad to be leaving, though he probably couldn't articulate exactly why the experience had been so uncomfortable. Marcus wanted to follow the customer outside, to apologize and explain that what had happened wasn't representative of the diner's true values. But revealing his identity would compromise his investigation and might prompt his employees to temporarily improve their behavior without addressing the underlying attitudes that created the problem. Instead, Marcus sat in stunned silence as the implications of what he had witnessed sank in. Patricia's whispered instruction had revealed the existence of a shadow culture within his business, one that operated according to rules and assumptions that directly contradicted everything he stood for. The discrimination wasn't accidental or inconsistent, it was systematic and deliberate, carried out by employees who understood exactly what they were doing but believed they were justified in their actions. The discovery forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable questions about his own role in creating the conditions that allowed such behavior to flourish. His absence from evening operations had clearly provided cover for attitudes and practices that would never have been tolerated during his regular business hours. His trust in Patricia and other long-term employees had blinded him to the possibility that longevity with the company didn't necessarily mean alignment with its values. Most painfully, Marcus had to acknowledge that the reputation his diner enjoyed in the community might be built on a foundation of selective service that excluded or discouraged certain customers while celebrating the loyalty of others. The warm, welcoming atmosphere he was so proud of might exist only for those customers deemed worthy of it by employees who had appointed themselves as gatekeepers of belonging. As Marcus prepared to leave the diner that evening, he understood that Patricia's whispered comment had exposed the true depth of the problem he was facing. This wasn't about retraining a few problematic employees or clarifying company policies. This was about dismantling a culture of discrimination that had taken root in his absence and developed its own momentum and justification. The challenge was no longer just identifying the problem or gathering evidence of its existence. Now Marcus had to figure out how to confront a system of prejudice that had become so normalized that his most trusted employees didn't even recognize it as wrong. He had to find a way to rebuild the culture of his diner while somehow preserving the relationships and reputation that made it worth saving. The whisper he had heard behind the counter had revealed a truth that Marcus could no longer ignore or rationalize away. The question now was whether he had the courage and wisdom to act on that truth, even if it meant destroying everything he thought he had built in order to create something better. Marcus spent the weekend in agonizing contemplation, weighing his options and their potential consequences. He could confront his employees directly, but that would likely result in denials, excuses, and temporary behavioral changes that wouldn't address the underlying attitudes. He could implement new training programs, but education alone wouldn't change hearts and minds that had already demonstrated their resistance to the values he espoused. He could fire the worst offenders, but that would devastate morale and might destroy the business relationships that kept the diner financially viable. By Sunday evening, Marcus had reached a decision that was both simple and terrifying. He would return to the diner one final time in his disguise, but this time he wouldn't remain silent. He would order his usual breakfast, the meal he had shared with his community for 37 years, and then reveal his identity at the moment when it would have the greatest impact on everyone involved. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching Marcus's somber mood as he prepared for what he knew would be one of the most difficult days of his professional life. He put on his disguise with the ceremonial gravity of a soldier preparing for battle, understanding that the next few hours would determine the future of everything he had worked to build. Marcus arrived at the diner just after the morning rush had begun, taking his familiar corner booth where he had sat during his first undercover visit. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to transform from invisible customer back into visible owner, in the same spot where he had first witnessed the discrimination that shattered his assumptions about his business. Sarah approached his table with the same indifferent efficiency she had displayed during his previous visits. Marcus ordered his usual breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, hash browns and coffee, speaking in the quiet voice he had practiced, but feeling his heart racing with anticipation and dread. As he waited for his food, Marcus observed the morning routine with new eyes, knowing that this would be the last time he would see his business operating according to the shadow culture that had developed in his absence. Jennifer was working the counter, treating some customers with warm efficiency while making others wait unnecessarily long for basic service. Miguel was calling out orders from the kitchen, occasionally making comments in Spanish that drew knowing smiles from staff members who understood the language. Marcus's breakfast arrived on a plate that was cleaner than previous visits, but the food quality remained disappointing. Eggs that were overcooked, toast that was barely warm, hash browns that had clearly been sitting under a heat lamp too long. He ate mechanically, studying the faces of employees he had known for years, and wondering how he had missed the signs of their true attitudes for so long. The moment he had been waiting for came, when a young black woman entered the diner carrying medical textbooks, obviously a student grabbing breakfast before class. Marcus watched as the familiar pattern began to unfold. The delayed acknowledgement, the perfunctory service, the subtle signs of impatience and disrespect that he now recognized as systematic rather than coincidental. Sarah approached the student's table with visible reluctance, taking her order with the minimal courtesy that Marcus had witnessed repeatedly during his undercover visits. As Sarah walked back toward the kitchen, she passed close to Marcus's table, and he heard her mutter under her breath, "Another one looking for something to complain about, I bet." The comment was the final straw. Marcus felt 37 years of patience and tolerance evaporate in an instant. He stood up slowly, his heart pounding as he prepared to shed his disguise and confront the culture of discrimination that had infected his beloved diner. "Sarah," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the dining room with the authority that had been absent during his undercover visits. "Could you come here for a moment?" Sarah turned around, expecting to see the timid customer who had been quietly eating his breakfast at the corner table. Instead, she found herself face to face with Marcus Johnson, her employer of 7 years, the man whose business she had just insulted and whose values she had been systematically undermining. The color drained from Sarah's face as recognition dawned. Around the dining room, other employees and customers began to take notice of the unfolding drama. Jennifer looked up from behind the counter with confusion. Miguel emerged from the kitchen to see what was happening, and conversations at nearby tables stopped as people sensed the tension in the air. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy with disappointment. "I've been sitting in this booth for 3 visits now, watching you work. I've seen how you treat customers who look like me when you think I'm not around to notice. I've heard the comments you make, witnessed the indifference you show, and observed the system of discrimination that you and others have created in my absence." Sarah's mouth opened and closed without sound, her usual confidence completely shattered by the realization that her behavior had been under scrutiny for weeks. Around the diner, the silence was deafening as everyone processed what was happening. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "This diner was built on the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. I spent decades creating a place where people could come together regardless of their background, their race, their economic status, or their appearance. What I've discovered in the past week is that some of you have been betraying that principle whenever you thought nobody important was watching." He gestured toward the young woman with the medical textbooks who was watching the confrontation with wide eyes. "That student over there came in looking for breakfast before class. Instead, she received the same poor service and subtle hostility that I've witnessed you provide to countless other customers whose only crime was not fitting your narrow definition of who deserves good treatment." Jennifer stepped forward from behind the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Marcus, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We treat all customers fairly. If you've seen something that concerned you, I'm sure we can explain." "Stop," Marcus interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "I've heard enough explanations. I've witnessed enough examples. I've listened to enough whispered comments and coded language. The misunderstanding isn't mine, Jennifer. The misunderstanding belongs to anyone who thought they could turn my diner into a place where discrimination was tolerated as long as it was quiet and subtle." Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through notes he had taken during his undercover visits. "Over the past week, I've documented dozens of instances where customers of color received inferior service, were charged for items that other customers received for free, were seated in less desirable locations, and were treated with suspicion and hostility that had no basis in their actual behavior." The dining room remained silent except for the sound of Marcus's voice as he continued his indictment. "I've heard employees make racist comments about customers, express frustration about having to serve certain people, and develop elaborate justifications for providing different levels of service based on their personal prejudices." Patricia, who had arrived early for her evening shift and was witnessing the confrontation from the kitchen doorway, finally found her voice.
"Marcus, I think you're being unfair."
"We work hard to serve everyone who comes in here. If there have been misunderstandings or mistakes, we can address them without making accusations about racism." Marcus turned to face Patricia, the woman he had trusted most among all his employees. "Patricia, 2 days ago I sat in this very booth and heard you whisper to Danny that he should watch a black customer because you know how they are about trying to skip out on their bills. That wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. That was a deliberate expression of racial prejudice that you felt comfortable sharing because you believed nobody would challenge you." Patricia's face crumpled as she realized her whispered comment had been overheard and remembered. Around the diner, the remaining customers began to understand the full scope of what was being revealed. Some looked shocked and dismayed, others appeared uncomfortable and eager to leave, and a few nodded with recognition. as if finally understanding why their own experiences at the diner had felt unwelcoming. Marcus addressed the entire room, his voice carrying the weight of 37 years of hopes and disappointments. This business was supposed to be a bridge between communities, a place where people could see past their differences and find common ground over good food and honest conversation. Instead, it became a place where some customers were welcome and others were tolerated, where service quality depended on skin color and social status, where the values I thought I had instilled were honored in my presence and abandoned in my absence. He paused, looking around the dining room that had been his life's work, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. I built this diner to prove that integration and mutual respect were possible in a community that had been divided by generations of prejudice and mistrust. What I've learned is that changing hearts and minds requires more than good intentions and inclusive policies. It requires constant vigilance, consistent enforcement, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Marcus turned back to his employees, his voice softer but no less firm. Some of you will argue that you're not racist, that you treat everyone fairly, that I'm overreacting to isolated incidents. But I've seen the pattern, heard the comments, and witnessed the system you've created. The evidence isn't ambiguous, and the impact on customers isn't debatable. The young medical student had been listening to the entire exchange with growing amazement. She stood up slowly and approached Marcus, her voice trembling with emotion. "Sir, I want you to know that what you're doing right now, confronting this publicly and honestly, means more to me than you can imagine. I'd been coming here occasionally for months, and I always left feeling like I had done something wrong, like I wasn't welcome. Hearing you take responsibility and demand better gives me hope that change is actually possible." Her words seemed to break the spell that had held the dining room in shocked silence. Other customers began to murmur among themselves, some sharing their own experiences of feeling unwelcome or witnessing discriminatory treatment. The conversation that Marcus had started was spreading beyond his employees to include the broader community that his diner was supposed to serve. Marcus realized that this moment represented both an ending and a beginning. The comfortable assumptions that had sustained his business for decades were gone, shattered by the truth of what he had discovered during his undercover investigation. But from that destruction came the opportunity to rebuild something stronger, more honest, and more genuinely inclusive than what had existed before. Looking around the room at employees, customers, and community members whose lives intersected in his diner, Marcus understood that the real work was just beginning. Exposing the problem had been painful but necessary. Creating lasting solutions would require sustained effort, difficult conversations, and the kind of moral courage that could only be maintained through daily commitment to doing what was right rather than what was comfortable. The whisper that had frozen him behind the counter had revealed a truth that Marcus could no longer ignore. Now, in the harsh light of public acknowledgement, that truth was creating the space for something better to emerge from the wreckage of his shattered assumptions.